Hey everyone, welcome back to Citywide Blackout, your home for music, movies, and more. I'm your host, Max Bowen. Well, it is October, so it is only fitting that we talk some horror. So for this episode, I'm hanging with Kevin Lucia to talk about his new book, October Nights, available on October 22nd through Crystal Lake Publishing. This is a collection of 4 amazingly horrifying tales, all contained within the fictitious town of Clifton Heights. We talk all about the world of Clifton Heights, how it came to be, and why it's been the setting for so many of Kevin's works. We also look at the 4 stories contained in this new book, and how this is something of a dream of his for so many years. Well, it's October, so it is only fitting we talk some horror. Right now, joining me is author Kevin Lucia to talk about his soon-to-be-released book, October Nights. Kevin, welcome to the show. It is so cool to have you here.
Thank you. It's awesome to be here.
All right. Now, there is so much to dive into, this book being a collection of 4 connected Halloween tales, all taking place in the town of Clifton Heights. I want to start there because reading your background, the other works you've done over the years, how did this become the setting for so many of your stories?
So, I've always been a fan of, authors who do that. Like, Ray Bradbury has his Greentown, Illinois, and Charles Grant had Oxrun Station. Of course, we know Stephen King has Castle Rock. Gary Brombeck has Cedar Hill. So I've always enjoyed, and even literary texts like Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood Anderson. So I had always kind of envisioned I'd like to have this town that I write about. And we used to vacation up in the Adirondacks all, growing up. And then before we had kids, my wife and I went up there. And there's just something about the atmosphere up there. It's just kind of got that, it's so isolated, all the woods up there and things like that. And I sort of kind of developed my own like little town there. It just started with a short story or two. And pretty soon I realized that the short stories had characters that were side characters in one short story, just in passing. Then I'd write a short story entirely about that character, and the idea was to kind of create this web, a lot like, Charles Grant's Oxrun Station novels. And I just, that's how it started.
Hmm. And how similar is like your Clifton Heights to the real thing? Are they like carbon copies?
There actually isn't a Clifton Heights. There is not in the Adirondacks anyway. There is a Clifton Park, and that's I think in New York. And I only discovered that after I started writing. But it's a complete fabrication. It's a hodgepodge of areas that I knew as a kid growing up at Harpersville, areas where I live now in Castle Creek, New York, and Binghamton, New York, and in places in the Adirondacks. So it's kind of my own creation, just modeled from areas of my experience and things like that.
How long did it take to actually like build this community?
Well, like I said, it started with just a short story or two, because what I wanted to do about 10 years ago. About 10 years ago, I was trying to write a novel in this town, and I really hadn't gotten to the point where I could finish stories very well. And then the novel was kind of falling apart. And I realized that, well, you've got a lot of character vignettes here that could be stories. So I wrote a short story taking place in Clifton Heights and sold it. Then I sold a couple more stories. And it really didn't coalesce until my first short story collection, Things Slipped Through, back in 2013. I had sold a story to Joe Mindhart at Crystal Lake when they were just starting out. And he just basically approached me and said, I love this story. Do you have a collection in mind? And I said, well, yes, I do have a collection, but this is what I want to do. I don't want to do a straight collection. I want it to be a linked narrative like Martian Chronicles or Dandelion Wine or something like that. And he's like, that sounds great. And that's what started it. And then just everything I wrote after that just kind of ended up building on it, and for me, I just imagine all the people that are in this town, and the type of horror that I like to write. I mean, I love schlocky 80s trash horror slasher flicks as much as the next guy. But when it comes to what I write, I like writing about people and their problems and their conflicts. And when you think of a small town, and especially you think of all the marginalized people that might live in that small town, or even if they aren't marginalized, even if they're higher up the food chain, they're still isolated by their status, things like that. I realized the story potential here was unlimited. When you think about, I'm very much informed by Stephen King. So I like writing stories about the guy who runs the landfill, or just poor this guy who works at the auto shop, or things like that. People that just would go missing, and maybe we wouldn't really notice it too much. And that's how it just kind of spiraled out from there.
Yeah. I definitely got that reading your stories, like the characters you create. For example, Long Night in the Valley, and your character for that, this like former basketball star who, because of just a accident, loses his entire career, his entire future. You really got the pain in his life, the way he talked and his actions, like everything spoke to this regrettable choice and the life that he was supposed to have, and now he's working for like a junk collector. He's just kind of existing. He's not really like living. I want to ask about your characters though. Do you ever base them on like real people that you kind of knew?
So, like a lot of young writers, when I was in high school, because I started writing in high school. I think I finished my first novel by the time I was a senior in high school, and it was this. Put it this way, it was the opposite of whatever Long Night in the Valley was. My novel had the kid winning the state championship, winning his girlfriend back, and all this. And when you're a kid, you kind of just take your fantasy of what you want yourself to be, and you write about a lot. And then I tried my hand at science fiction. A lot of my science fiction sounded like kind of warmed over Star Trek novels. I remember very clearly. I was working. It was toward the end of my college career. I was like, man, I'm in debt. I need to get out of debt. So I picked up a bunch of extra jobs, and one of those jobs was like third shift at a gas station, in a somewhat seedier part of town. And I was listening to my coworker one night talk about her life, and in some ways it was kind of almost stereotypical. She was a single mom trying to raise her kids. She's talking about trying to make rent the next week, and so and so my ex won't pay the I can't remember what it's called now when you get divorced. They won't pay the
Alimony.
and alimony, yeah. And I just had this like little flare, and I'm like, this is what real people are like. You're writing these square jawed, dimpled heroes in your sci-fi stories. And that was right around the time that I started reading Stephen King. Like the first two novels that I read by him were The Stand and Desperation. But I had that threshold moment when this is what real people are like. These are what real stories are like. And it took many more years to really gestate that, but I really began thinking about people and looking at people. And a lot of times, you'll be out and you'll just see someone doing something, and it'll just stick in your head. You're like, why was that person doing that? Or just imagining their stories. And that was a really important, as far as like, look at the world and don't create this idealistic, hero, look out at all the people in the world and kind of find your stories there.
How do you know when you've kind of nailed a character that they're ready to be in your book?
Oh, well, I know when I've nailed a character, when I find myself understanding them. I know what it is they're afraid of. I know what it is they desperately are trying to achieve, or, how they failed. I always say that, I feel like I'm there when I'll start out with the barest sketch, and I'm writing some things down, and then I'll just sink right into and be like, oh, this is what he's afraid of, or this is how he failed, and this is how he's trying to redeem himself. And maybe I already know he's going to try to redeem himself, and it's not going to work out. So when I really feel like I've gotten there and I got that emotional resonance, and there's been a lot of characters where I just kind of tapped out and said, yeah, I'm not feeling anything for this at all, but I'll know when I've got that. It just strikes that emotional chord in there. I'm like, yeah, this is what I want to write about.
Mm. So do you have this like cutting room floor just kind of full of all the characters who just like didn't make it for you?
Oh yeah, I'm like every writer. I'm a pack rat. I've got a file just labeled stuff, because I never throw anything away, and I'm like, well, that guy didn't work for that story, but maybe we'll be able to fulfill him in a different story somewhere else and things like that. Yeah, yeah. There comes that line where I'm just like, I don't really care about what's happening to this character, so I'm like, we'll just put that aside and we'll move on to something else.
Yeah, because I think with horror especially, there's that trope of the cannon fodder, the character that is just there to be murdered, and they bring
Right.
nothing to the story. You don't
Yeah.
care when they're dead; they're just there to be like a blood splatter on the wall.
I'll never forget when I was reading I was reading one of Stephen King's Dark Tower novels, and not to drop a spoiler, but he killed someone. And I was so mad. I'm like, I love this guy. How could you? And that was again another like, oh, you got to get people to really care about this person, and like people are always complaining, oh, Stephen King he'll spend 10 pages on a postman and then kill him. And I'm like, no, that's great. I mean, if you just talk about a postman and he gets killed, nobody cares. But if we know this postman is divorced and has one kid at home and he's trying to hold, and then he dies, then you're like, oh, that's not fair. And that was again another threshold moment when Stephen King killed that character, and I was so mad. I'm like, that's important to note that.
Exactly, exactly. How about creating the settings for these things? I read that you get a lot of your inspiration from like folklores and myths. So is that like a real crucial part of the story process, like looking up these different like myths to try and bring into the
Yeah.
story?
Yes, and I love doing that. That was an Achilles heel early on because I felt too much pressure to be super loyal to the myth. But as my reading, and Charles Grant did a really good job with this, where maybe he'll use the myth as a jumping off point, and you do have to, of course, be careful. Um, depending on what type of myth you're playing with. Like if you're playing with Native American myth or an African myth, you do want to be careful of cultural appropriation and things like that. But I found that a lot of these myths, I mean, they're myths for a reason because they've been oral tradition has maybe changed the roots of them, or I remember teaching in junior high that there's 700 different versions of the Cinderella story. Every culture has its Cinderella story. So what I learned over time is that's a great for, like, for example, last year I wrote a novella that'll be coming out in a collection pretty soon about a gigantic spider god, and I was able to find a lot of, and I sort of patched together my own little thing. But I found all these different cultures that revere spiders and things like that, and then you can kind of make your own thing that sort of sounds plausible because people might have heard that somewhere. And then I do enjoy doing that. Yeah.
I got nothing against these other cultures, but if spiders are their god, I want nothing to do with them.
Yeah.
I see
Yep.
a spider, I kill it. The end.
Yeah.
But I want to ask about cultural appropriation. Obviously, a very serious
Yeah.
topic, something you should definitely avoid in the writing. But how do you do that? How do you sort of take enough from the story to put it in yours without kind of crossing the line?
It's really, really tough. And this is one of those things where I think it's best framed as a conversation, because not everybody is going to be on the same page. Not everyone's even aware of doing it. Like, for example, I have a novel that I'll be sending out to agents here pretty soon. It's basically a weird Western with Billy the Kid and the Regulators and flesh eating monsters. And I had a character in there that was like this half white, half Apache. I did study my some of my Apache backgrounds and things like that. And one of my early beta readers said, "I love this, and I love this character." He said, "Some of your readers might be a little upset because you've made a magical Indian." And I'm like, at that point in my life, I'm like, I didn't even know what a magical Indian was. So I went and Googled it, and then I read it, and I'm like, crap, I know what a
Well,
magical Indian. Oops. So we had to do some work on that character. I think the biggest thing is my feeling is, are you, and this is where I think I wish things like this were framed more as conversations and less accusatory. Of course, the people who are doing it also need to be sensitive enough. If someone says, "Hey, you've kind of done this," not to be like, "Oh, there should be an open dialogue." I think if you're writing a story and you have authentic cultural characters in there who are the main characters and they're not just props to set things up, then I think you're on the right track. I wrote a story that I have yet to sell that involves Native American trickster gods. But I made all of the main characters Native American. I didn't use them just to. Another good example is on Shudder. I recently watched a series called Trickster, and it's wonderful. Highly recommend it. It's set in a Native American community, and all your main characters are Native Americans. The writers are Native Americans. So this is not a case of cultural appropriation. This is, your main characters are Native American. They're not using it as a prop to let our non-Native Americans go. And that's probably if you're on the right track. But it really needs to involve conversation, because, like I said, I didn't even know what magical Indian was until someone pointed it out to me, and I'm like, oh, you're right. I need to change that.
Yeah, exactly. And I really like your approach to it and your thoughts on it, because I agree. It cannot be, while on the one hand, we definitely need to be sensitive and respect other cultures. People pointing out need to stop with the torches and pitchforks. It doesn't help. It needs to be a calm, rational discussion that everyone can learn something from.
Yes. Last year, so I teach high school English as well. And last year, my 12 AP, we did a unit on horror and race, and we talked openly about Lovecraft. And, I think the biggest issue there is the one side saying, burn all of Lovecraft's works, never read them ever again. The other far side is completely tone deaf. How dare you criticize Lovecraft? When really we should be having an honest conversation. We can be grateful for the gift that Lovecraft gave us in the outer gods and his mythos. I always joke that my favorite Lovecraftian writer is not Lovecraft. His mythos is wonderful. His writing inconsistent. But we can be thankful for and also be aware of how big of an impact that's played on sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. But we have to be honest. Once you unpack the racism box, there's a lot of those stories where he's describing Aboriginal people with ape-like faces and big lips, and you're like, but there needs to be a conversation there. And that's what I told my kids last year in that unit. We got to be honest about this stuff here. I mean, he did name one of his cats and the rats and the walls a racial slur, but we also, and there needs to be a talk. We need to talk about it and not, like I said, go at each other with pitchforks.
Exactly. So let us move on to diving into the stories of October Nights. 4 stories in this book, all connected. You've got a priest hearing a ghostly confession that comes into play later on in the story. A young man offered a chance to remake his entire fortune at great cost. A pastor fleeing the death of his daughter comes to Clifton Heights to face his fears and lives a nightmare instead. And 2 people with supernatural talents facing off with an engine of darkness and pain. I love these different concepts. Going through the process, though, of deciding what to flesh out and pursue as a story, what were you looking for this particular collection that sort of decided, okay, this idea we're going to work with, this idea, get rid of it?
What I really wanted is I wanted 4 different types of Halloween stories. Keeping in mind that, again, for me, horror is about people, and Halloween is a night of transformation. It's a night of endings. It's a night of beginnings. The night when the veils thin, and I want to use that as a vehicle for talking about people. Obviously, it allows supernatural shenanigans to happen, but I want to talk about. But I also wanted each story to be very, different. Whereas in the Rage of Achilles is a Halloween story, and it's a haunting, but it's also very on a personal level about the autistic boy and things like that. I like to think of Long Night in the Valley as a Halloween Twilight Zone episode. That's my feeling about that. The end story, One Last Pitch. That one, I wanted just an action one that moves. Everything happens in one night. The chapters end up getting very, very short. And I wanted that classic good versus evil. The Last Will and Testament of the not so good Reverend Ford, that is very much a longer tale where he spends time in Clifton Heights. And it's very much kind of a soul searching, facing your demons, coming to grips with your failures, and a quest for redemption that may work out a little bit differently than Long Night in the Valley. And I wanted them to all be different, but I wanted them to move. You know what I mean? There was one story that was originally in there, um, and it just wasn't moving. It was called Daughter of the Mists, and it was about. It's obviously, again, we never throw anything away. It was about a cinephile who works at the library at Clifton Heights, and he absolutely loves the old black and white movies, for their purity and their nobility. So he reveres the old black and white, monsters. And I created a lesser known actress and a character, and he just feels there's so much above the tawdry monsters of today until he accidentally channels this being into life and finds out that this being that he's revered is just as bloodthirsty and nasty. But it wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't moving anywhere. So I said, it's slow. This might just be a short novel on its own. It's not gonna, with a collection of 4 novellas, you want it to be just long enough to engage. But there's going to be another story after this, and there's a couple stories. So I felt like I was hitting Daughter of the Mist, and I was just grinding really, really slow. So I decided to replace it with a not so good Reverend Ford, because that was a very experimental work that I thought, we'll just stick in there. Because what happened was I just went through this kind of binge where I was just watching every low budget 80s movie I possibly could watch. Everything from Basket Case to Berserker to Maniac, just The Edge of the Axe, and all these. But what I started doing is realizing that even in the cheesiest of horror movies, there's still a kernel of, well, this is why this movie's happening. This is what's also too. I'm an English teacher, so my mind is always interpreting even the lowest common denominator. I'm thinking, well, the subtext here is like even a movie like Frankenhooker. I'm like, well, the subtext of this movie is. So what I started developing was I hadn't fleshed it out into the story yet, but I would watch these movies and I would jot down this narrative of someone who's watching all these movies and slowly having the subtext of these movies impinging on his life in a very real way. And then that's where the story of the not so good Reverend Ford, because he's not only a disgraced pastor, he's a closet horror fan, because being a pastor, especially in stricter congregations, this is, verboten, and as he's goes to Clifton Heights, checks into like one of the, a cabin there, and he starts just watching horror movies to try to escape. But what he's finding is those horror movies are not letting him escape because they're circling right back onto him and feeding into what's happening. And that just seemed to be, that's fairly long in itself, but it never hit that dead spot that Daughter of the Mists hit. So I swapped it out.
Okay. All right. Now, I know that this is also a bit of like a life goal for you to publish a collection of Halloween-themed stories.
Yeah, I love Halloween. Yep.
Yeah. What about the holiday do you like so much?
There's on many levels. Obviously, just being a kid, just that idea of the whole month of October is leading up to Halloween, and that one night when obviously I don't trick or treat anymore, but we take our kids trick or treating, and I love it when we go to people who've like done their houses up to the nines and things like that. We have a town that's near us, or the whole town, just the whole several blocks of the town do their porches up and things like that. And it's always, I love seeing that. I took my daughter and her friends to Reaper's Revenge the other night and did the haunted hayride and things like that. So I just love the you know, the pageantry of it. It's October. I'm a horror fan all year long. I watch horror, but when you hit that mid September and the leaves are out and it's got that, you're walking out here and those crickets chirping in the evening. I just feel like there's something different in the air. I've always wanted to write something specifically set in that. Like I'm actually finishing up another Halloween novel, a full novel right now, and I'll just go out and sit on the front porch in the early evening and like listening to the crickets and writing this thing and just kind of channeling that fall energy in there. And I just never written any explicit books for Halloween. And last spring, I started putting it together. And then I asked Joe at Crystal Lake, I said, "You got an October slot?" And he's like, "I do." I'm like, "All right, then."
Let's talk about Crystal Lake, because I have had a number of writers on the show that have been published through that company. And definitely, folks, if you love horror, check out Crystal Lake Publishing. They have some of the best out there. How did you come to their attention, and what's it been like working with them?
So back in 2012, I think I sold a short story to one of their very first anthologies. I think it's called For Fear of the Night. And Joe just outright he bought it and then he emailed me and said, "I love this story." They had only put out two collections at that point. And he said, "I love the story. Do you have a collection?" And I said, "I do, but I've got this wacky idea of a link collection." And he totally ran with it. So I've been with him from the beginning. And what I love about Joe is, the small press in many ways I can't speak for science fiction and romance and crime fiction. I don't know anything about those genres. But for the horror genre, throughout the generations, the small press has been kind of like the backbone and the lifeblood. Like every time in the 80s, and then more recently, about 10 years ago, when leisure fiction fell apart, when the big publishers, there's a sag in horror, the small press is always there. And I think with the ease of POD publishing and ebooks, some small presses have really stepped up to the plate and really done a great job. Now, what I like about Joe, though, is a lot of small presses have started out awesome, then flamed out, or they simply didn't. The very first press that I worked for or worked with was Shroud Publishing back in 2010. They actually published my first novella like in a series. And it was basically a series character that they hired us all to write. And I used to work for the magazine, and it was a wonderful, wonderful product. But it was basically run by one guy, And after a while, life, you're just not able to do it anymore. But then some publishing companies end up overburdening themselves with too many titles, too many releases. That was another publishing company. Devourer of Souls is a Clifton Heights book, but it was originally published with Ragnarok, and they just put too many books out. And again, that was a 2-3 man operation, and they just kind of buried themselves. Joe has been really smart about gauging. Okay, I need to slow down a little bit. I'm going to limit how many books I accept next year. I'm getting a little burned out. So he's been able to, I mean, they've been going for over almost like 10 years now, and they've done a really nice job. He's also really done a really smart job of separating my personal finances and the publishers, because a lot of small presses have done that too, where you get the idea that they're financing this out of their own pocket. And while that may be noble, if you have a financial emergency come up and now you can't pay your royalties or you can't pay so he's done a really good job. Every year they do a Kickstarter campaign to make sure their projects are funded for the year ahead, and he's just a really, really good job doing that. Now, I would say there are people out there that are fans of Crystal Lake as a publisher, period, which means that when books come out, they're lining up to buy the new Crystal Lake book, which is really nice as an author to know that you're working with a publisher that has built-in fans. So it's been great working with them, and so.
Excellent. Now, earlier on, you mentioned that you are an English teacher, and I also
Yep.
read that you are also an ebook and trade paperback editor for Cemetery Dance Publications. I'm curious how that's impacted you as a writer. Do you find yourself like self-editing a lot?
So the ebook job is very recent. I just got that within the last 3 weeks. The ebook editor at Cemetery Days used to be Norman Prentice, and he and I are good friends. And he let me know that he was moving on. So I've been working with Cemetery Dance in some capacity for again the last 6 or 7 years, and I threw my hat in the ring because they also want to start a new trade paperback line, which Cemetery Dance has always been a limited edition publisher for years. What they want to do is they now want to enter the small press game as a traditional publisher. Their books can be ordered in bookstores, and I think that'd be great, and that would that would I think it would enhance them. It would enhance the horror community. That hasn't really impacted me too yet because I just started. I'm only gonna take submissions over the summer because I have my summer off. So right now I'm just working with marketing the books that are already there. As far as being a teacher, so and my if my beta reader ends up watching this video, he'll probably get a good laugh. When you're in teacher mode and when you're in writer mode, I find them to be distinctly two different modes. So I'm in teacher mode during the day where I'm grading kids' essays and things like that. And I would like to say that I put out fairly clean copy because of that experience. And I'll go through and edit a draft at least 3 or 4 times before I send it to my beta reader. But my beta reader, who really knows his grammar, will make comments and be like, "How can you do this in the subjunctive mood? I thought you were an English teacher." And I'm like, dude, I was worried more about the character and their development. So I found that people either think with, you know, that strict grammarian brain or story brain. And when I'm writing, I'm mostly in the story. Although being an English teacher has helped me as far as editing my own work, I don't really apply the same grammar rules a teacher would then to my own writing because I'm really just concerned about the story.
I get you. Now, you mentioned having a beta reader, and I wanted to ask about how their input influenced October Nights. Do you wind up making a lot of changes based on their own feedback?
So actually, this time the beta reader did not get October Nights. The turnaround was so fast on this, and we had a very, very short window. Luckily, Crystal Lake had several beta readers on hand that were able to give me very good feedback. Usually, the feedback from my beta reader is, let me know if the story is slowing down a little bit, or he likes to joke that I have a terminal case of conjunctivitis. That I like to start I like to start sentences with conjunctions all the time. He jokes and says, if you could put five conjunctions in a sentence, you would. And I'm like, yes. That's unfortunately reading too much William Faulkner and Ray Bradbury. But usually the remarks are stylistic, few notes, typos here. Occasionally they'll be like, this paragraph does not add anything to the story at all. And then I'll cut it out and things like that. So I did have one editor from Mystery Road, which is a limited edition from Cemetery Dance, who just via me. I had a scene where a character does something really violent, and my editor's like, you have to take that out. He said, you just destroyed all the empathy that you've built up for this character with this one act. And I tried to soften it a little bit to keep it in. And he's like, no, you don't understand. It's got to go. And then I did that, I could see, yeah, okay, that's better. That makes more sense. So I'm always very open to critique. I don't think there's any other way to go about it, really.
Oh, definitely. But do you ever have a moment where someone will say, okay, this has to happen, and your response is, nope, it's got to stay. I'm not moving on this one.
Once. And ironically, this editor who thought very highly of himself, not too long after that, absolutely burned all of his bridges in the horror community, is now completely excommunicado for something different. One of my short stories that was in the horror library series, I had the character was on a lonely highway stopping at a one of those big 24-hour rest station things, and for some reason the editor was convinced that the front door couldn't be an all glass door. And I was like, I just Googled it and sent him like 5 pictures of all these service stations where the whole front of the service station was all glass. I'm like, are you kidding me? And he finally bent and he let me do it. But I was like, and I was wondering about that. I'm like, he was really like, that seems to be a weird thing to be he was a little bit arrogant about it. I'm like, okay, well, here's the 5 pictures that prove you wrong. And it wasn't too long after that his arrogance got him into trouble, and now he's not even a blip on the horror genre. So that was really the only time. Most of the time, people will suggest stuff to me and be like, "Yeah, you're right. I see that. I see how that could be made better."
Glass door on a service station. That is a weird hill to die on.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. I was like, okay.
Would it have actually done anything if you would change it to be just like a wood door or a metal door?
I don't know what he wanted. It was just such an odd, absurd thing. I was just like, look, here's 5 pictures that prove you wrong. I'm not changing it. Exactly. And he said, all right, I'll go with it this time. Like,
okay. Well, thank you so much.
It wasn't too long after that same attitude got him into a lot of trouble.
Yeah, sounds it. Now, this next question, I imagine, is like picking your favorite child. But is there any story in October Nights that you think is your personal favorite?
I'm going to say the one that I'm most proud of and that I put the most of myself into, and the one that I'm most terrified that people will be not like, would be the Not So Good Reverend Ford. That was very, coming from a Christian upbringing myself, and considering myself a practicing Christian, but also very much being at odds with how that's played out publicly over the last couple of years. With we don't want to go into tangents about politics or COVID or anything like that, but even just growing up in the church and not being allowed to question things and not being allowed to be your own person. You're told growing up that God loves everyone for who they are as long as you act this way, and so I put a lot of that into that story, not as an attempt to necessarily skewer Christianity, because I still consider myself a practicing Christian, but for me, fiction is a canvas for me to really wrestle with these things that I really struggle with this. I'm really, and that one will especially again as a father of a daughter, I put a lot of myself into that story, a lot of my own fears. What happens in that story between him and his wife and his kids has no relation to my life at all, but there was a lot of that deep, dark fears and things like that of my own that I put into that story.
Okay. I read that last spring, back when the pandemic was at its really most intense height, you saw the publication of your first hardcover limited edition novella, Mystery Road, and which I imagine was an amazing experience, especially during such a weird time when all the things that go along with writing, going to cons and expos and festivals just could not happen. But yeah. How has the last year and a half been for you, and did the events ever influence you as a writer?
So, initially during the pandemic, I think I was a lot like everybody else, where I found myself, and I was a teacher, and we were obviously sent home for the rest of the year, and we were trying to virtual teach. We didn't even know how to do it, and I had all this free time on my hands. You're like, man, you could have banged out all this writing. I don't think I wrote a thing. I was just I couldn't even read. I found myself watching lots of movies, but I just was, and yeah, it was a weird, because here's my box of Cemetery Dance books shows up at my house. I'm like, oh, awesome. I can't go anywhere. I can't sell any of these books. And one of my favorite memes that a lot of writers were passing around, and I can't even remember what it looks like. The top meme shows a whole city on fire, and the bottom meme shows Will Ferrell going like this. And it's like, hey, want to buy my book? So you kind of felt like, here's everyone's going through all this, and I was like, I got a book if you want to buy it, Last year turned out to be pretty good, though. We went back to school. We were one of the only schools in our area that managed to go back 5 days a week, because we're a small private school, so we were able to manage the social distancing and all the things that were. But we had kids at home, we had kids at school. I was able to get back into the writing, but I didn't really write anything COVID related. In fact, most of the stuff I was writing, I was just sort of pretending COVID never happened. Like October Nights takes place in an alternate universe where COVID never happened. But ironically enough, the novel that I'm writing now is about a different small town up in the Adirondacks, and it was about this evil that was slowly taking over the town. And I was sort of grappling with the mechanics of that until I realized, I'm like, if you just do a super ultra small town that had to quarantine and everyone's staying indoors and no one's going out, this becomes really easy for the evil. So I've got now, again, you start with the human element first. I've got a really small town that's almost like it's already in a self-induced coma because of COVID restrictions. And then this evil gets introduced. So while everyone's isolating at home, everyone's remote learning in school, remote working, you got this thing picking people off one by one. Nobody really knows any difference anyway, because even if people are not going to virtual school, everyone's got Zoom burnout and things like that. So that was the first time that actually, but I knew I wasn't going to be able to write about COVID during COVID, because that's just, you write, especially for me, I write about difficult things after I process them and happen. So.
Yeah, I feel like any book that really puts COVID into it is running the risk of getting some serious backlash. Like one of my favorite authors recently put out a new book, and COVID, it's not really like the story, but it's in the background of the story. And I always thought,
right.
I read to get away from reality, and here it is back in my face. So I kind of had some mixed feelings. I mean, they weren't making light of it. It was just sort of part of the scenery.
Yeah, exactly.
It's definitely tricky. Well, now that we are seeing the return of things like book festivals and Comic-Cons, places where authors like you usually go to, share your work, are you feeling good enough to go out there again?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm vaccinated. My whole family's vaccinated. So this summer we went back to Scares That Care charity convention down in Williamsburg. Had a wonderful time. And about 2 weeks ago we did a Halloween horror book signing at the Barnes & Noble at Wilkes-Barre, PA, and that was an outdoor event because it was really nice. But it was nice to get back out there, and it's one of those things where once you've had, which everyone should be vaccinated, things like that. And like I said, if tomorrow they told us we had to quarantine again, obviously I'd do it. I don't think anybody would be happy about it. But I think at a certain point, you've had your shots, you're being safe. You either have a choice of not attending these events ever again, and like Scares That Care was handled very well. It was going to be non-mask mandatory, but then with the Delta spikes, they just said, okay, during the convention is mask mandatory again. Which was fine. It was just so nice to get out there. And I've got a couple other appearances, and I've got plenty of books because I have books just sitting here for a whole year and a half I wasn't able to sell. So it's nice to get back out again. Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. Well, Kevin, I am thoroughly enjoying October Nights, and definitely recommend highly to folks. This comes out October 22nd through Crystal Lake Publishing. You go to Kevin Lucia, that's LUCIA.blogspot.com. You'll find all the links to purchase the work, follow his socials, and much more. And Kevin, thank you once again, and definitely looking forward to the next conversation.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hey guys, what's going on? This is Brian Murphy from One Time Mountain, and you're listening to Citywide Blackout with Max Bowen.
Rock on.
Okay, everyone, that brings this episode to a close. Big thanks to Kevin for joining me, and be sure to pick up your copy of October Nights, available on October 22nd through Crystal Lake Publishing. I've got my copy already, and I gotta tell you folks, it is amazing. Perfect for this Halloween. You can follow the show on Facebook under Citywide Blackout, and Twitter and Instagram under Citywide Max. Get at me at citywidemax@yahoo.com and follow the show wherever you check out podcasts. As always, keep those ears open and happy Halloween.